Okay, so tonight's topic is advocacy, policy and government relations, which on the surface you'd think might sound a little bit dry, but for those of us who know both the health sector and especially the international development sector, these are key elements of what needs to be worked with, the sort of things we need to be doing. Advocacy is everywhere. To get anything done, you need good policy basis. And to have good policy basis, you need good government relations. So we're going to explore what there is to learn about working in those three areas. How do you influence policy? How do you work effectively with government? And how do you ensure that your organisation or an organisation that you're working with has a voice in critical debates? And how do you prioritise what is a critical debate and what gets the priority in terms of policies? So this is all part of a vital part of working in the aid and development and humanitarian sector, and one which attracts a lot of interest and needs a lot of discussion. So to our guests, we have a very esteemed guests tonight. I'm just going to touch on some key elements for both of them, these two impressive women, leaders in their fields. I'll start with Jennifer. So Jennifer is the Global Health Manager with Results Australia. Got over 15 years experience in areas of health, policy and leadership. Her work has been very broad, covering government, corporate and non-profit sectors, and that's something I'm going to touch on between the both of you, because you've both worked literally around from all different angles in terms of government, non-government, private sector, not-for-profit sector, all that sort of stuff. So we'll look at all that. Key communications with stakeholders, I believe, is and fostering collaboration is a keen passion of yours. Plus, something I'm often pushing with my students is that evidence-based decision making and data. Looking at data-driven decision making. You need that as a basis for anything to happen. Then we go to Bridie. I need more paper. I won't go through it all. Just the basics. So Bridie is the CEO of Development Intelligence Lab, and she will explain that further in terms of what it is, what it does. Like I say, I have highlighted that certainly to some of my students in terms of a source of information, really interesting resource to go to. She's also the co-founder of AP4D, and for those who don't know, AP4D is the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. So AP4D for a much less of a mouthful.
Never let me name anything ever again. Just putting it out there.
We're all used to acronyms in this industry, that's fine. 3 years with ACFID as a director, 8 years with the Attorney General's Department, which again is that government side, that'll be interesting, and even 2 years as a senior manager in private sector consultancy. I've got a whole lot more here. It's a big list, but I'm sure most of you have actually all read the bios of both Jennifer and Bridie, and are hopefully suitably impressed. I'm not quite sure when you get time to sleep with everything that's listed, but I'm really pleased to have you both here tonight. So thank you for coming. Where were the frustration levels? You obviously sound like you enjoyed going out in the field, whether it was PNG, whether it was going out with the government group, representative group to different communities in Australia. Did you quickly develop a frustration level in terms of what was apparent that needed to be done and what was being asked for, and what perhaps didn't then translate through to possible policy?
Yeah. So taking the Papua New Guinean example, I think if you're working in development, I think you need a healthy dose of understanding that you are not the change, and that change happens in an environment in a slow and steady and very non-linear way. So my day-to-day life in Papua New Guinea was fantastic. I worked with a group of 10 all female lawyers, would you believe, in their Department of Justice, a group of reformers who wanted a different looking nation.
Locals.
That was all local, fantastic. My frustration came when you saw periodically Australia getting in the way of that sort of thing and dealing with my own system. Now that is very, very, very common in a career, all right? And so I was very lucky that I had a boss that was teaching me how to lean in and navigate that. And some very, very early coaching around, just because I think that things should happen in a certain way and they don't, then she taught me I had a choice about what I was going to do about that. And that's when I built some really savvy negotiation skills, because I was basically pushing the proverbial uphill to get Australia to do something about corruption in that country at a time when Manus Island was open and Australia needed it to be open and did not want to upset elite Papua New Guinean leaders at the time. So I found ways to build coalitions of people. But yeah, certainly that is a level of frustration. My personal philosophy, though, is that if that's getting in my way as a professional, then I know it's time to look at myself, because if I'm blaming everybody else for everything.
But you haven't reached that point yet?
Not at this point. I feel really passionate about what's ahead for Australia. I would be equal parts skeptical, frustrated and hopeful, and that's a pretty good mix for this role.
Very, very, very true. Jennifer, I just want to touch on something you said in your introduction. When you first went to Cambodia and you said it was a real wake-up call, there's often that difference between what we have as a perception when we're working in the development area or in the public health sector, whatever it is here, but when you actually get on the ground to the reality. Did you find that you absolutely had to question a lot of the preconceptions and the assumptions you'd made, and what sort of frame did that take?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I was so entrenched in the Australian system and the Australian medical system to then be thrust into an environment that was so different to what I was used to, and the equity was, or the inequity was so apparent in the hospital systems that we were dealing with, and even with the doctors, they were fly in and fly out, so you didn't have the continuity. You would have language barriers with the doctors, and it was just a completely different experience. And I think that yes, like there was a shift, but it almost had to happen immediately to get any progress. So it was, I landed, I had to have a take of the environment that I was working in and get an understanding of it to actually then start to make progress. And I feel like that happened pretty immediately, because otherwise, you wouldn't even been able to take small steps forward. So, but I think the experience with Cambodia, what was so important is that concept of privilege and how we decide to act on that privilege we're given. And I think that that's probably something that's apparent in all the choices that I've made throughout my career. And that's probably the tie to it, is that while it hasn't been linear, or why it seems a bit kind of mismatched and all over the place and different environments, it's always looking at that concept that the people that I'm working with or the people that I'm working for don't have something that I do, and so making sure that I work to provide that. I think it's probably...
So I was going to ask you, how did that experience then feed into the roles? Because you've taken on very different roles, be it the fire service, be it the COVID one is really interesting in terms of working with policy to create policy around COVID. That must have been like on the run.
Yes.
Given that we weren't expecting it, and certainly not to the degree we got it.
Yeah.
Creating that on the run, what was that like in terms of creating policy, but also how did your previous experience feed into that in terms of the way you assessed what needed to be done in reality?
Yeah, it was definitely, what's the saying, building a ship as you were sailing it. I think that the whole kind of health department was doing just that. And, I think that one of the key things was that, we were in it together, but the days were stressful. We would work our shifts until 10 o'clock at night and wake up in the morning and have another shift at 8 a.m. We were calling parents to tell them that their kids had been exposed to COVID, and, they didn't have an understanding of what COVID was, and you had a limited knowledge of what COVID was based on, the limited research that was available. So it was a very stressful environment that you were working in. But I think that probably one of the key learnings from that is, the ability to kind of detach from that emotion and really look at the situation that's been handed up to you and looking at things from a creative lens or looking outside of the box. And I think that's probably something that I've taken with me all the way through, is that, you know, if we keep doing the same things the same way, we're not going to create change. But if we stop and we process and we look at the situation, there's different ways around the things that we do, and there's different creative ways that we can look at it as well. We just need to make sure that the people that we're working with or the people that we're working for are willing to kind of accommodate that creativity as well.
So when you're talking about, you know, having to do all those long hours in terms of working on policy and obviously a bit on the run, part of that, you know, with the example you gave in terms of talking to parents and trying to talk to them about what COVID actually was, how much of that is the advocacy? Is that something that became separate, or did that naturally have to have a connection where you had to inform people, you had to advocate about COVID and quickly inform people about, you know, never mind the misinformation that was going around and the disinformation, but quickly inform them about exactly what it was, what the impact of it was, and therefore what they needed to do, and relate that to the policy you were trying to create?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was about time as well. Like, it wasn't rushing through the information that we were given. It was spending the time to speak to the family, spending the time to speak to the person that you have on the phone, and just understanding the emotional, I guess, the emotional journey that they're probably going through as well. But yeah, I guess with the creating the health policy, you know, I think that came much later on, after the COVID pandemic was slowing down. But I guess the advocacy, the health policy and the advocacy probably sat separately, and I guess the advocacy for the COVID vaccinations and things like that came much later on, rather than the pandemic, because the pandemic we didn't have the vaccinations available. All we could do was tell families the information that we had, or that was being handed down to us by, you know, Brett Sutton, for example. We'd have the meetings with him and we were able to kind of impart that knowledge. But it's, you know,
and that is where the advocacy really kicked off, isn't it? Like, in terms of once we had vaccines, that's where it really had to make its mark.
Yeah, and
letting people know what they were and why they needed them.
Absolutely. And, you know, from the team at the Department of Health, the public health specialists that were on the ground, you know, it's probably a testament to the people that were working in that field, how, you know, accepting of the situation the Victorian public were, because of the time that the people on the phones and the public health specialists were able to sit down and spend with them and make sure they were kind of using emotional intelligence to deal with the situation that was given to them. So.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, Bridie, you were saying you don't see yourself as an advocate in a lot of ways, and it's all about, you enjoy the policy aspect of it. But in looking at the importance, I guess, of the connection of the two, so I was going to move on to AP4D as an example. So that AP4D works, I mean, you probably need to explain slightly what it is, and I won't give it its long name again, but working with the government in developing policy, or at least in laying that essential groundwork through research and consultation to facilitate that development of policy. And then again with Dev Intelligence Lab, I find it interesting in that opens up discussions around many of the issues in many of the key issues in development. And I'm even really pleased and interested to see in the updates I get, you're doing a podcast. You do a podcast with the interviews you do now. So it's that, one of the things I've always enjoyed about you is that it's just that sense of innovation. You're always looking for an opportunity or a new space to explore. So in terms of, let's say, well, you can pick either AP4D or Dev Intelligence Lab. In terms of the work that's being done there, how's that link? I mean, a good amount of that, certainly with Dev, with the Intelligence Lab, is advocacy in terms of just highlighting the issues that are at hand and exploring them so that people know, and using that as content. But then also how that then links into a lot of the policy work that's going on.
Yeah. All right, Jill, so you're right. I'm basically like categorically allergic to the status quo when the status quo is not working, right? And that's definitely been something that is a wonderful part of my career, but it's like an absolute headache if I get bored or I just really got over just how broken a system is. I do tend to try and nudge it a bit. And I think that so I founded 2 think tanks now. So the Asia Pacific Development Defence Diplomacy Dialogue was the first, and now the Development Intelligence Lab, where I am full time. And it's probably a good comparison to help explain the different roles that we all have in how our government creates and ultimately implements policy. Because I see something like international development policy, if we want our nation making better development decisions about how we engage in lower and middle income countries around us, then it doesn't just require one advocate. So when I was an advocate at ACFID, my job was to march up onto the hill in Parliament House, harness all the CEOs around, get all of the access and meetings possible, prep them with talking points on why it is that Australia's aid budget must increase, right? So that's the advocacy role. You have a position, you're firing a position at government, right? You're making press releases when the budget gets dropped. You're wielding both a carrot and a stick, and your public media presence is absolutely everything, okay? That is when you're advocating for a really significant change. Now, ACFID sits in sort of a middle ground advocacy type position, right? Oxfam is way out ahead of ACFID, fighting for various injustices, flips of power, different ways of doing things, maybe a dismantling of the colonised version of aid and development we've sometimes seen in the past. Now, this is not in conflict, right? This is Oxfam advocating bigger and better, and your peak body in Canberra coming in and backing them up with some noise at politicians in a slightly more reasonable position. And then all the other people in the community, be they academics publishing articles about how it is that Australia could change their way, be it others like think tanks engaging in closed door Chatham House roundtables with policymakers where they can sit there and honestly say, we don't know what to do, what do you think? And I can get 15, 20 experts around the world to come and problem solve with them. I see Australian development policy and public policy writ large, doesn't matter if you're at state government or elsewhere. It is the product of like a diamond, right? And diamonds have lots and lots and lots of different faces. So never would I, for example, think that NGOs have the primary domain on advocacy in this country, because they're only one part of the picture. We need our extraordinary research community. Importantly, we need local leaders in countries like Cambodia or Vietnam or Papua New Guinea also engaging and advocating at our government. So you need both reasonable discussions, evidence-based discussions, and you know what? And this is what I see the difference between policy work and advocacy work. You need those people out there blowing shit up and getting a headline in The Australian that makes the Conservatives listen, right? So I think for me, the difference between, and what I'm super passionate about with both AP4D and the Development Intelligence Lab, is certainly what I saw at the time around the public conversation of aid and development. And bearing in mind, I'm talking about a space where it's like, does Australia care or not? Other countries in the region, are we so obsessed by AUKUS and the UK and Europe that we're forgetting what is on our doorstep, despite the fact that a pandemic showed extraordinary challenges in our near neighbourhood? When you're working at that high level Commonwealth sort of federal policy level, which is not pretty or comfortable for lots of people, it's pretty messy, then I guess I was seeing that every time as an advocate I walked into government or parliament, we would sort of sit there playing our parts. I would say something along the lines of, well, Minister, as you know, the Australian people care about aid and development. The Minister would say, yes, Bridie, as you know, my government is doing everything, right? And then I'd go over to Department of Foreign Affairs and, you know, we'd be in this big bloody boardroom with windows everywhere and fluoro lights 1,000 times worse than this and certainly no wine. And I'd say,
Maybe one
Well,
would have helped.
So would have, well, we'll get to that, it does. Secretary, my members are somewhat concerned about you decommissioning such and such. And she'd say, well, there was a very comprehensive process that I can't talk about. And I'm there going, and then I'd meet these people in the street whilst you're waiting for a coffee, right? And I'd have these cracking conversations. And I was like, there's got to be a better way for me to influence policy, because you know what? I'm not good at telling people what to do, but I'm really, really coercive in helping them understand. So I was like, how do you create a think tank that is complementary to ACFID, complementary to NGOs, is a place where extraordinary experts from all around the world, researchers, academic, and our government officials can come together and have a constructive forward-facing conversation. And again, as a bit of a boundary rider, our progressive friends probably think I'm conservative, and my conservative friends probably think I'm progressive. We were able to create a very neutral space at the lab where we have innovated all the normal things that a think tank does. So very briefly, when we have a meeting, it's not under fluoro lights, it's actually in a warehouse. It's candle lit. There is often wine there. Everybody has to walk in, no matter how important they are, on a first name basis. We issue rules of engagement. You better not have your phones there. You better come in ready to change your mind. If and when you change your mind, you better tell the other people in the room why and how and on what basis. And by the end of that 3-hour process of that, instead of my talking points discussion, a dynamic engagement between people, then we walk away, or they walk away, with a list of the top 10 things that group of experts think Penny Wong should do next, right? So that's our meeting schedule. The way that we do our blog, for example, instead of one high-level person's opinion on one issue that they chose to write about, we have government sending us issues they have and are grappling with live. We identify those issues. We ask one question. We get 3 short, sharp perspectives. If you look closely, there will always be a very senior established professional, not always from the development community, alongside a young and or more diverse person publishing 300 words each, right? Because we know our policymakers are not reading more than that. Our podcast is commuter length. It is purely designed to get people to actually think about evidence. So we get a researcher on there. It will sound like a very friendly chat. We can see exactly who is reading that, how they're engaging with that, and behind closed doors, we're getting that researcher in front of policymakers to try and forge ahead on a little bit of evidence-based policy. So I think for me, that's the difference between advocacy and policy. Is advocacy, I'm there no matter what, representing a constituency saying, I want. Policy, I walk up to government and I say, what's keeping you up at night, and can my organisation and our experts help? And sometimes that's really hard, right? Either because they don't understand what good policy advice looks like, they're just being used to advocated against. Or sometimes it's because when we do the research, our answers are not just more money for the aid budget, and that's something to navigate.
So where does the balance lie in terms of, there's a lot of advocacy for a lot of different issues, but when you're talking about doing it at that level, with government in the room and think tanks and experts and everything else, advocacy needs to be impactful, obviously, for it to be, or needs to be effective for it to be of any use in leading to policy. What would be the balance in terms of the sort of advocacy that you find yourself doing in either of the think tanks, as to the impact it has, like how effective it is in leading to policy? Is it most of the time you find advocacy works really well, or is it a lot of the time some of it just is ineffective?
So neither my organisation or AP4D do any advocacy. Okay. So the difference between a think tank and an advocacy organisation is a think tank, we only survive if our knowledge is super independent
Okay.
and neutral. So we advise, right? But for example, I would never go out there advocating for an increase in the aid budget on behalf of my organisation. I might make a comment that looks a little bit more along the lines of, we do have a boutique aid budget. It is going to be difficult for government to realise its policy ambitions without it. But it's not what we do. What we do is we inform decisions. We don't advocate for an outcome. So for example,
Sorry, I was just going to say, so do you accept, so do you get advocates feeding you then? In terms of
Yes.
advocacy groups feeding you
And-
as part of that expertise?
Right, 100%. We have access and trusted relationships that advocacy groups would kill to have,
Okay.
right? So advocacy groups sometimes have extraordinary power at a macro level, but they don't always get access to influencing how a particular big program is going to happen in Cambodia. We might be facilitating the whole dialogue on that. They may not necessarily have access to every ambassador in their Rolodex or know how to engage them. That's core business for us as informers of policy work. The challenge is we are a welcome place for everybody, right? So we welcome the advocates, we welcome the managing contractors who operate commercially, academics and everybody else. The limit is we don't accept funding from an organisation that has a predetermined outcome. So the latest big campaign, which I think is a fantastic campaign, it's called Safer World for All. It's being run by Micah and a group of NGOs. They came to us, said, can you help us write the policy for that? I would have died to have my team working on that. However, I knew that we could not, hand on heart, as an independent think tank, write that policy because the only predetermined outcome is more money in the aid budget.
Okay.
And my team, whenever we're engaged to do work, it's a research outfit. We have to explore what the issues are and deliver independent advice.
So what do you do in that situation? Do you refer them on to
I did in that
else?
situation. She was
That
really
must
good.
scare you.
Yeah. And that happens a little bit, but honestly, and this is what I say about the public, I guess the public policy diamond, we need advocates out there pushing the boat on things. It's just that as a think tank, we tend to play more in the knowledge informing, brokering, solution generation space, and to be trusted to do that, to be trusted for my analysts to walk into government and for government to say, we don't know what to do here. We're not going to go and, put a big media piece out the next day. It just wouldn't work like that. It's not to say I'm not very connected to all the extraordinary advocacy that happens and might also inform that. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Jennifer, I was interested to notice, and I think I said to you before, just as a coincidence, with my, in terms of teaching, my global health unit, we actually were looking at women's health issues today, and we actually looked at the Results Australia page for a couple of sort of reference points as part of the shoot we were doing today. But one of the things I had picked up on earlier was that you have a page on your website titled Become an Advocate. So you're throwing it out there. So it says here, like, quote, those interested in supporting efforts to achieve global health equity and end global poverty. So what are you looking for? If you're throwing it out there on the website, what are you looking for? What makes a good advocate? And what is that you're looking for in putting that out there?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So we do a couple of programs. So we do Become an Advocate, and that's all about using everyday Australian voices. So not having any prerequisites, but just having the thought that I want to do more, but I don't know how to do more. And I think that's essentially the prerequisite for, signing up to become an advocate. We also have campaigners for our Garvey campaign, which builds into the Safer World for All campaign.
Okay.
So we are advocating for the Australian government to put towards 1% of the federal budget to AID, which is the Safer World for All campaign. And then within that, give certain buckets of money to organisations like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund, who are up for replenishment next year. So the campaigners who sit different to our advocates are signed up for this specific purpose. So we have campaigners for our Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance replenishment, and that's all about people passionate about global health and vaccine equity, but also new people within global health and teaching them the skills to advocate for the issues they're passionate about. So last month we had a session on amplifying your voice on social media, and we used Beach Agency to help advocate how to advocate on social media, and then we've got our campaigners designing social media posts and videos. Next month or this month we have our Writing for Advocacy learning session, and we're using a speaker from Today Design to talk about how to write for advocacy. And next month we'll have a speaker from the previous Greens, Richard Di Natale, talking about how to engage with your MP. So the campaigner program is more of a kind of short-term advocate program to teach kind of people that are passionate about this area some of those key skills.
Can I just clarify something for people? Quite often, if you share a passion, like I think the development sector does, for looking to ignite change from leaders, what you often see is exactly what Jen is describing, which is almost a multi-pronged strategy. So you've got campaigners in this instance mobilising people in their local constituencies to write to their MP, invite their MP in for coffee and ask them what they're doing on the aid budget, right? So you've got this noise and engagement demonstrating to leaders that, you know what, the people who vote for you care about aid and development. So that's often what we broadly term a campaign. What you then will be having is a level of government relations engagement. So that might be happening where sometimes similar people or people like Jen will be up in Canberra or in behind closed doors, then stepping into those spaces off the back of the campaign and saying, you know what, it's not just us NGOs, it's health professionals who believe in this, it's our Defence Force who believes in this, and they'll be mobilising. If this is your outsider game, then this is your insider game, right? So that if you imagine you're a senior official, you're hearing in your electoral seat this energy about this aid thing, and you're going, where's this coming from? Why is my inbox blowing up with these great beach designed emails and these requests for me to speak to all these extraordinary students? These young people seem to care about aid and development. And then you rock up into Canberra and these big, important people, seemingly completely unattached, are marching into your office for discussions. And they're not just coming into your office, they're coming into your Labor Party friend's office. And, oh my gosh, they're over the aisle. They're in the Liberal Party as well. And then you go, whoa, there might be something in this. What's going on here? Well, how would we even increase the development budget? I know I'll go and commission some expert advice from some people who are neutral, independent, and will actually tell me what does and does not make a difference when it comes to international development. And they might then come and have a little chat to us. But this is a very kind of usual way that goes. And complete plug, the three people that Jen just messaged, they're brilliant. So we've engaged Beach. Di Natale is fantastic to work with, and Today Design. If you haven't looked at their online magazine, they're super cool. So you should get onto that. Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry.
No. That's great. I was going to say, so that sort of shows everyone how obviously the links between advocacy and where it leads to, but how much of that, if you have everyone feeding into that from their community level through their MPs all the way up the chain, I guess, again, how how much of that is good advocacy and how much of it sort of hits walls. I mean, it's all nice thinking that works in terms of going to your MP and then he's going to start making noises in Canberra and people are going to start going, how much of the time are you hitting walls in terms of them saying, yeah, we've got just too much on our plate, not interested?
A lot in international development space. I think that it's fair to say that Australia has a bucket of challenges, right? I don't know how you're going with cost of living, but it's not pretty in my world. Concerns around housing affordability are serious. Hate to break it to you, but you don't win an election off the back of increasing the aid budget, so it just doesn't really rate all that highly. And certainly, even if you were the foreign minister, right now you look around the world and she's going to be having her day full of a million worries, including potential PRC interference, the degradation of the rule of law, what's happening in the South China Sea, Gaza, Lebanon, and all the rest of it. The truth is aid and development just does not rank within the priority set, I think, of this government. Does it rank higher than previously? Yes. Right, and that's, I think, enter AP4D and the Development Intelligence Lab. So the lab, if you have a look at the website, it is not branded like Oxfam, right? There is nothing progressive that you can see from the outside. The term intelligence in the title for us means the lived experience of people in the region. I can guarantee you we get more invites into the National Security College just because we have intelligence in the title. There are ways that both the Development Intelligence Lab and AP4D, I think, are positioning to have a broad-based discussion about how Australia engages on development in the region that I personally think I don't think it's a matter of would we have more success or not, but I can tell you I've been extremely surprised by the extent of engagement we've had, and we measure meticulously how much demand for our advice we get, and there are certainly ways that we can track where our advice has been taken up, including in a lot of them, we might not put this in, but in a lot of the planning of how Australia is redesigning every single country's engagement that we have at the moment. It's my team that's designing and facilitating how we make those decisions. So I do think that at this point in time, I would hazard a guess that the lab is having more policy impact at this point in time than external advocacy, but all of it is essential. We wouldn't have that impact if that campaign was not out there. Will we get 1%? Probably not, but that's not the point, right? We might get 0.1% and that would be success.
Yeah. And I guess the main emphasis is on the fact that at least the discussions are being had, the conversations are being had, they're looking for policy. The question is, how many policies can they deal with? I said to you earlier, I've done some work with AP4D this year that, I've been asked to be on working groups and that and been part of those consulting groups. And it's amazing, even when I just look at the website, even aside from the couple I've done, when you look at the website, just the number of elements, the number of policies or the sort of research they've been asked to do on a whole range of different topics. How many of those are actually going to become policies? I mean, there's a level at which you sort of think, how many policies can the government actually process at any point in time? Certainly through its, period in power.
Yeah. And I think that there are too many, right? The issue of policy incoherency is significant. I think, to be fair, AP4D generate ideas themselves, so they're not operating. There is engagement with government about what they will publish on, but it's not very often that they will be requested. So they do that work for public interest, conversation, debate, etc.
I thought they were being invited by like, for example, OTP or something to do some research and to do some different things to create policy.
It's always relevant, but they're not consultants for government by any stretch. For us, we tend to do work where we can see a policy window open.
Okay.
So we will, and AP4D think about this as well. It's very similar and normal in think tank land, but we certainly never have a conversation for the sake of a conversation. That's a luxury you can have in academia. Think tanks are chronically underfunded in this country. We fight just as hard or harder than your small NGOs out there for the funding we get. But the funding we get, we know that we better deliver the best policy relevant advice that can be acted on possible, or we may not get funding to do it again. Just like in an NGO, you have to demonstrate impact to those that are giving you money to deliver results. We do as well. So you'll see we will only actually work on an issue that we see a policy window open on, because otherwise you end up with, for example, junior officials who come to your warehouse function with your vino, who are not in positions of power to make the sort of reforms that we need. So I think what you're touching on though is, what is the absorptive capacity of government to listen to all of us on all these issues all at the same time? And that's where the power of something like a MICA campaign or the Australian Council for International Development that helps us all focus our attention is very, very important, I think, because otherwise it's everything for everyone all at once.
Okay, and one of the points that might come up there, points of interest there for me is that how much, I mean, you were saying, obviously, for instance, Penny Wong's obviously got her attention in other areas rather than thinking about aid and development. How much can you gauge that the government want to pay more attention to aid and development and would put the funding up for aid and development if they could, to your 1%, but there is just so much going on that requires their attention. They can't actually do it, or like you say, perhaps more likely with the Conservative government we previously had was that they're not interested in the aid and development budget.
Yeah. So the lab hosted the Minister for International Development and the Pacific's 1 year anniversary speech on the Australian aid and development policy that was released about a year or so ago. It's recorded, so it's on record. He point blank said, if I look to increase the aid budget, then that will basically give a slush fund to the Liberal Party for the next election, right? So that is this government naming the issue of bipartisanship as the single biggest blocker to whether or not they will increase aid and development expenditure. For those of you budget nerds out there, if you look outside the aid budget, and it has been put back on sort of a stabilised path, and depending on how you want to work your economics, it is looking to at least stay stable and or increase. That is not necessarily something to celebrate if you compare it when you go back a number of years. So sort of choose your economic modelling there, but it doesn't look great even if the government is saying that it's an increase. If you look beyond that aid budget though, you see some really quirky things happening. So even though perhaps this government would be timid to be out and proud on aid and development, in the Pacific, for example, the expenditure, only 50% of it is the Australian aid budget. We are significantly increasing other forms of finance and support. And increasingly, a lot of analysts, and that's what I would identify as an analyst as opposed to an advocate, a lot of analysts are seeing that development results are happening and can be generated by things outside of the aid program, whether it be visa-free travel, whether it be opening up access to our health and our education systems to the region, whether it be supporting banking in the Pacific to make sure that unbanked populations have a level of security, right? So I do think that on the one hand, the skeptical part of me is saying this government is blaming a lack of bipartisanship and asking unfair things of the NGO sector to create bipartisanship for itself before it increases the aid budget. Like, the skeptic in me is like, calm off it. That said, I can see more innovation that's happened in aid, around aid and development in the last 5 or 6 years. Not all of it great. hello, we're way back into infrastructure financing. Not a little bit unsure how that. I got there's somebody up the back going woo. We're
sarcastic.
we're back into providing direct budget support to other countries. I'm sorry, these are into financial systems that are not necessarily reliably delivering for people in those countries, and we seem to be signing checks. And the bucket of debt that is headed towards Papua New Guinea is tipped to hit about $3 billion by the end of this year. But we're pretty quick to point debt trap diplomacy elsewhere and just justify that our debt is better than our northern friends, which I find a little bit of thin reasoning. So I think it's an area where certainly at the lab we're wondering if the NGOs and the campaigners are doing such an extraordinary job pushing on this issue of bipartisanship and the aid budget writ large, what service can we do by having a broader conversation about the sorts of things that do and don't generate development outside of an aid project. So that's how I'd be reading it, fairly sceptically.
Okay. Well, wrap it up there. Thank you both very, very much for joining us. I hope everyone's enjoyed the conversation and the discussion. And we want to thank Jen and Bridie very, very much. So we have a small Women in Aid Development gift for each of you. These are like little
Thank you.